Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me. I will take my mask off. Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Harro van Asselt, and I'm a professor of climate law and policy at the University of Eastern Finland and also an affiliated researcher with the Stockholm Environment Institute. And I'm also a work package leader of the NDC Aspects project. And as you can see on the slide, NDC Aspects stands for Assessing Sectoral Perspectives on Climate Transitions to Support the Global Stocktake and Subsequent NDCs, which is of course very relevant in the current context. NDC Aspects is a 3-year long project funded by the European Commission, the DG Research, in which we're indeed trying to look at basically how we can support the global stocktake by looking at a few specific sectors. And we will have my colleague Wolfgang Obergassel who will talk about the project in more detail. But maybe as a reflection also on the global stocktake meeting this morning, the technical dialogue meeting this morning on mitigation, I think some of the messages that I've heard most often from the different parties and non-party stakeholders that were in the room were first that we need to have a sectoral approach to issues, and second of all is that we need to learn from countries' national experiences. And in a way, this is exactly what this side event here today is going to be doing. So, let me start by first briefly introducing our speakers and then also sharing a few household remarks because as you probably already noticed, this will be a hybrid meeting, so there's a few things to take into account. So first up, we have here in the room our colleague Wolfgang Obergassel, who is the co-head of the research unit on global climate governance at the Wuppertal Institute in Germany, who's together with Lucas Hermille from the Wuppertal Institute, who's unfortunately not here anymore. He provides overall leadership to the NDC Aspects project. So Wolfgang will first introduce the project, its main goals, the rationale of the project setup, as well as the structure and organization. Then we'll next have Dirk-Jan van de Ven, who will be joining us online. So fingers crossed that everything will work out and there are no gremlins in the lines. And he is joining us from Spain, where he works at the Basque Center for Climate Change, or BC3, where he's a postdoctoral researcher. Then, given that Dirk-Jan will need to leave also relatively soon again for parental duties, we'll have Q&A for his presentation right after that, but then we'll move on to the next presentation, which will be given by Saritha Vishwanathan, who is currently with the National Institute for Environmental Studies in Japan, but he is also working for the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad, and she will also be joining us online, again hoping that everything will go smoothly. And she will be focusing specifically on sectoral challenges in the context of India, looking at the energy sector. And last but certainly not least, we have Sebastian Oberthür, who is the director of the Research Center for Environment, Economy and Energy at the Brussels School of Government at the Free University in Brussels, as well as a colleague of mine at the University of Eastern Finland, where he's a professor. And Sebastian will finally take us from the national to the international level, looking at both the supply and demand in terms of global climate governance, focusing on specific sectors, looking specifically at the example of the industry sector. Now, before I hand the floor to Wolfgang, just a few important household remarks. So as I already said, we'll save the Q&A in general for the final bit of the side event. I'll give people an opportunity to ask any questions for clarification if they have any. And as I already indicated, following Dirk-Jan van de Ven's presentation, we'll have a quick Q&A so that he can answer any questions while he's still with us online. Also, the event is being live streamed, so please speak when you have an opportunity to speak here. Please speak in the microphone, clearly introduce who you are, where you're from, which affiliation you have, and try and be concise in asking a question or making a comment. And then lastly, for those of you who are joining us online, you have an opportunity to ask us questions via the chat. I haven't seen how it works yet, but I will try and do so during the event. And I'll also try and monitor the questions that will arise and post them to the panel that we have here. So with that said, I'll now hand it over to our first speaker, who is Wolfgang Obergassel. So Wolfgang, the floor is all yours.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Harro, and thanks to all of you for coming this way. I think this is probably the farthest away corner of the whole conference. But very glad to have you here. So, I'll be briefly presenting an overview of the project, as Harro already said, before we then go into the individual or some of the individual elements of the entire project. If you go to the next slide, please. They're one by one. Too bad. Yeah, maybe you move a couple of bullets or, yeah, thanks. Yeah, so overall objective of the project is, as Harro already said, to support the global stocktake and the development of new and more ambitious NDCs by learning from previous NDCs and understand the conditions for subsequent NDCs. In particular, we want to systematically identify transformation opportunities and challenges, trade-offs and synergies with, for example, other agendas like Sustainable Development Goals. We also want to determine benchmarks for collective progress and derive ambitious yet realistic national pathways for selected countries. And in terms of enabling conditions and options for enhanced climate action, we're looking at policy and governance options. We're doing transdisciplinary engagement to validate and promote policy options. And we want to identify and formulate options to enhance sectoral governance also at the international level. So looking at national levels and the international level. And of course, we're also doing dissemination and exploitation of our results, like at this event here. Next slide, please. And we're doing this in a sectoral approach because in our view, both opportunities for action as well as barriers to action differ very strongly from sectors to sector. For example, electricity is already relatively advanced, still not nearly fast enough or far enough, but relatively advanced compared to other sectors. And in other sectors, or in some sectors like energy-intensive industries, it's still an issue of initial technology development and deployment, whereas for electricity, it's much more an issue already of scaling up, disseminating widely. And you have different importance of social issues, of institutional issues, overall very different sets of issues in each sector. And for this reason, we think in order to identify where the opportunities are and also where the barriers are and how they can be removed, it's necessary to look at it sector by sector. And by the way, we would also recommend this approach for the global stocktake because the sectors are really, in a way, in the arenas of action that need to be reorganized and mobilized in order to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And we are not looking at all sectors there are, but we decided to focus on 4 sectors that have so far proven to be particularly hard to abate, namely energy-intensive industries, transport and mobility, the building sector, and then finally agriculture, forestry, and other land use. And as we are, of course, also looking at cross-sectoral integration, not only the sectors by themselves in silos. Next slide, please. And we have a number of work packages in this project. And the core component of the project is work package 1, what's in the center here on the slide. We are convening what we call sectoral conversations, which are going to be fed by input from all of the different work packages, and where we are convening experts from within the consortium and also experts from outside the consortium in order to discuss our findings, validate, to develop our thinking further, and to ultimately to have robust results and robust recommendations for policymakers and other practitioners. So to quickly go through the other work packages, so work package 1, as I said, is the core, it's the sectoral conversations. Then we have work package 2 from the quantitative side on global conditions and benchmarks. Then work package 3, also quantitative on sectoral modeling, so for the 4 target sectors we have. Work package 5 is qualitative policy analysis of challenges and policy options. Then we have work package 5 on national pathways in our target countries, which I'm going to in a second. And then work package 6 on global governance and international cooperation. And of course, also the usual dissemination, project management, and ethics. And all of this for each of the 4 sectors, as I said. Next slide, please. Yeah, and we are targeting 20 countries overall, which are depicted on this map here. And for 7 of these countries, or groups of countries in the case of the EU, we have national partners. So for these countries, we are going to do especially detailed analysis of their national pathways and options. And for the other ones, well, we also have networks, but there we are not going to go that much into detail as for the 7 tier 1 countries we have. Next, please. Yeah, and this is our consortium. So as I said, partners from 7 of the countries, regions of countries, from South Africa, from Russia, from the United States, Indonesia, South Africa, India, and then a couple of European countries doing the quantitative modeling and the qualitative policy analysis. Next, please. And that's it for the project overview. And with that, I would say, without further ado, we're going to move to Dirk-Jan.
Right. Thank you, Wolfgang. Before we move to Dirk-Jan, just are there any immediate questions for clarification? And you'll have a chance to ask Wolfgang other questions later on as well. But just wanted to double check. I see nothing in the room, and I think the chat at the moment is not yet working, so I haven't seen anything online yet either. But then we will indeed move on to Dirk-Jan van de Ven, who will be joining us from Spain, if I'm not mistaken. Dirk-Jan, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you. I don't know if the sound could go a little bit up, just to make sure. Right, and then we move on.
That's Sebastian's slide.
Yeah, and I'll be able to control your presentation, Dirk-Jan, so just tell me when to move to the next slide.
All right. Okay, I can see it a little bit. Yes. So thank you, Harro and Wolfgang, for the introduction. And thank you, everybody, for attending our site event. So I'm going to present like a study, like a narrative that we came onto when we were quantifying benchmarks for our sectoral analysis. We kind of found that over time, pre-published mitigation scenarios, global mitigation scenarios have evolved, showed a clear evolution. And we thought that it's actually an interesting evolution to focus on. So this I will go a bit over this work now. So next slide, please. So the modeling of climate change mitigation is mostly through integrated assessment models has been booming over the last decade. So there has been really exponential growth in the amount of scenarios, probably driven mostly by the scientific emergence of climate change mitigation. And there have also been clear efforts by the IPCC and most concretely by the EASA team in Austria to harmonize the scenario reporting. So to have common templates used between different users and different modeling teams and over time. And 3 of those such 3 reports have been published by now with such common templates, which have been very useful for us to analyze these mitigation scenarios and also for benchmarking. So can you click? Harro? The first report was in 2014, AR5 report on mitigation, where initial collection of almost 1,200 scenarios was of published scenarios was included from 31 models and including scenarios that were published until 2014. Then in 2018, Harro? Yes, the special report on the 1.5 was published with over 400 scenarios from 12 models, covering scenarios up to from 2015 to 2018. And then in this year, in 2022, Harro, the AS6 report on mitigation was published with over 3,000 scenarios from 95 models, and covering all scenarios published from 2015 to 2021. This also includes those published in SR 1.5, by the way. So in this evolution, we see like analyzing these three reports over time. We can see like how the average mitigation scenarios has been evolving over time. So next slide, please. If we're talking about evolving, we can. I'm mostly talking about like mitigation trajectories. So what kind of where are we getting emission reductions from what sectors, from what technologies? So this is really what basically shapes how the mitigation is, the scenario is structured in terms of mitigation. And there might be different potential drivers for these evolving trajectories, such as scenario structures, technology assumptions, the coverage from the models used, and also the representation of real-world policies. So just on a next slide, please. The results I will be showing have been drawing figures using this methodology. So I was first we ordered all scenarios by report and accumulated CO2 emissions from energy and industrial processes from 2010 to 2050. With a note that the SR 1.5 scenarios were excluded from the AS6 scenarios datasets to have like these 3 time steps clearly defined, and we included all scenarios that were kind of seen as mitigation, which have at least some mitigation effort. So until up to around 2.2 degrees of warming. And for each metric, we exclude all scenarios that are not reported. We do not report the required variables, and we calculate like the mean, median, and the quartile ranges by report and by 100 gigaton increments. So this will be showing in the next few figures. So in the next slide, yes. So these figures will be all a bit like this. So on the right, you see the legend. So the red part is the AR5 dataset. Which includes the scenarios until 2014. The gray shaded part is the SR 1.5 scenarios from 2015 to 2018, and the green part are the AR6 scenarios from 2019 to 2021. So and there's also like a probability scale of these different cumulative gigatons of CO2, so that to have idea like which are 1.5 degree compatible, which are 2 degree compatible. So on the left, we first on this slide I just summarized some overall mitigation methods. So we have like one common famous one is CCS, so carbon capture and storage, which these kind of scenarios are known to be quite reliant on this technology for being well, basically for being able to cover like all kind of mitigation without going without deep transformations. But we see that over time the reliance on CCS has been declining. So from AR5 to SR 1.5 to AR6, we see a decreasing role of CCS. The role of bioenergy at lower not so deep mitigation scenarios have been decreasing as well. On deeper mitigation scenarios, it's not so conclusive. But what's very clear is that like the reliance on wind and solar in the last scenarios, certainly since 2015, has been increasing a lot. Before the share of wind and solar hardly ever reached 15%, and in the last scenarios it's comfortably over 30-35% in deep mitigation scenarios. The next slide, please. Sorry. Just to quickly go over the different fossil fuels. The use of coal is clearly like outsourced in these mitigation scenarios from SR 1.5 onward. SR 1.5 onwards. Like before the reliance on coal was like around 15%. Even in deep mitigation scenarios, 10-15%, and in the last scenarios, it has been dropping really to 5% in the deepest mitigation scenarios. The share of oil is not so conclusive in such scenarios, and the share of gas is also slightly dropping, certainly in deep mitigation scenarios, where before gas played a bigger role as a transition fuel towards deep mitigation. Next slide, please. So, which is mostly on electricity. So, in terms of electrification of final energy use, which is very important for the different sectors, we see that at not so deep mitigation scenarios, it hasn't changed a lot. But for deep mitigation scenarios, we see a much stronger electrification, where towards 50% of final energy use. And importantly, a big next figure shows that a big part of this electrification is through renewable electricity, which is also much more than before, where renewables, which include here solar, wind, biomass, hydro, and geothermal. They in the first report in AR5, they usually didn't go for more than 50%, and in the last report it's often about 80% in deep mitigation scenarios. This does not only go at cost of fossil fuels, but also, for example, technologies like nuclear, which kind of says it is basically really cost-driven. This evolution can be explained by cost assumptions, which is as the assumptions generally of renewables have been showing much clearer cost reductions than that of nuclear. Next figure, please.
Next slide.
So when we are looking at the different end-use sectors, we also see some clear evolutions. So certainly on industry and transport, we see a much bigger role of the sector contributions towards mitigation in the last report compared to the first report. Well, for buildings it is less clear, and for AFLU we also see a much more negative role, which means like a higher reliance on deforestation, on afforestation in the or a reduced deforestation in the last report. And finally, next slide, please. Just I think the title is wrong, still in your version, but it's on GDP impacts. This I think is a very interesting figure as well, because we see that in AR5, like it was clear that deeper mitigation required stronger losses of GDP, but in SR 1.5 this already was reduced a lot, the reductions, and in AR6 they are further reduced, and they are in several scenarios even like negative, which means like there are positive impacts on GDP with deeper mitigation, which is also a very interesting observation from these past mitigation scenarios. So just next slide, please. Just have some overall conclusions. So we see in many of those figures a continuous evolution of most metrics. So from AR5 to SR 1.5 to AR6, which kind of shows a clear direction of the narrative. So it's not like going up and down, back to one direction and then back, but it's clearly in the same direction over time. We see a higher electrification and renewables and electricity, lower reliance on CCS, bioenergy and coal, and much more on wind and solar. a stronger role of end-use sectors in mitigation instead of the conversion sectors, the supply sectors, and a significantly lower mitigation cost in the last reports compared to the first one. And this basically most of these observations can be accounted to faster than expected cost reductions of renewables, mostly solar and wind, and storage. So this is probably the most driving factor why we see this evolution in scenarios. But it's important that to take into account that this is quite these scenarios are usually taken given a lot of importance, because these are like the idea of they should be drawing the future of mitigation. But this analysis shows that they are really affected by the zeitgeist, so by the spirit of the time, when the scenarios are made and published. This kind of indicates that we should be careful when interpreting results as being prescriptive, as they kind of really strongly depend on assumptions, on expectations at the time. So yes, thank you for your interest. Any questions? I'm here. I think it's also the wrong email here. I sent you a slightly updated version later, but I think it was too late.
Right. I'm sure that Sebastian would be happy to take all of the questions that you can't answer right now, Dirk. Right. Thanks, Dirk-Jan. Also, you reminded me of what the delegate from India said this morning at the Global Stocktake, the technical dialogue, that it would be really nice to compare scenarios as they were in AR4, AR5, and AR6, and you're well ahead of him by looking and comparing these different scenarios. As I already mentioned, but maybe not for those of you who have just joined us, Dirk-Jan needs to leave in about 15 to 20 minutes, so we want to take any questions that you have regarding this particular presentation right now before we move on to the other presentations. We have a mic that can go around. So are there any questions in the room? And in the meantime, I'll check online as well. Any questions for Dirk-Jan about his presentation? Right. And please introduce yourself briefly, say who you are and your affiliation.
Hi, my name is Jan Burg from German Watch. I have a question regarding the GDP numbers you presented on the second last slide, between the difference of GDP losses of AR5 and AR6. What are the main reasons behind that change would be interesting for me.
Thank you.
Yes, I think.
Sorry, can I ask the technician to maybe put you on the? Can you put the speaker on the main screen? So we can. All right. Go ahead, Dirk-Jan.
Yes. Thank you for the question. I mean, what the reason really is, we can basically just guess, because I don't know all the scenarios in detail, and I haven't seen all the papers in detail that publish those numbers. But I think a clear suspicion is that really that renewables have become cheaper than fossil energy in many cases. So this basically is, depends, of course, on the model settings and the model assumptions, but this overall trend makes that investing in clean energy in some cases is saving. So basically is to a certain extent improving GDP. Of course, if you go to deeper mitigation, that's not always the case. But this I suspect is the strongest reason here.
Right, thanks, Dirk-Jan. I'm just looking through the room to see if there are any other questions. Again, don't be shy. Right. Okay, just again, keep in mind that Dirk-Jan will not be there at the end of the presentation. We might be able to answer questions for him. But if not, then we'll move on to, and I'm just still looking into the room. All right, we'll move on to the next presentation. Thank you so much, Dirk-Jan, for joining us. So we'll move on by the next presentation from Saritha. who I just figured out is actually now in Japan. So it's very late at night for you, Saritha. And you'll be going through our discussion, and I'll put the slides up on the energy transition in India. So thanks, Saritha, for joining us this late, your time.
Yeah.
And the floor is all yours.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, yes.
Okay. I think there's a slight delay for me to look at the slides, so I'll just start off. A very good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for being here. It is my pleasure to present India's perspective on the sectoral challenges we have to achieve net zero as a national level case study. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I would like to take this opportunity to inform the audience that this is an academic work. So we do not represent the, our views do not represent the climate negotiation, the position of India at climate negotiations. It does not reflect the official policy or position of Government of India. Next slide, please. I would provide a brief outline on the Indian energy systems with the scenario framework, the results that we did, discussion, the stakeholder engagements that is ongoing, as well as the current work on coal transitions in India. Next slide, please. Maybe you would want to do 3 clicks because I think I did. Okay, so I'll just start off. So India is the second largest producer and consumer of coal. And we can just see that it's 1/5 of China's current production. We employ about 15 million people directly and indirectly in connected businesses. 4 states of India, the revenue comes from coal royalties. The most of the coal production, that is 91%, is thermal coal. The coal that is extracted is through surface mining. And additionally, 200 million tons of coal is imported every year in India. We are the 3rd largest energy consumers. At the same time, we have one of the lowest per capita electricity consumption, as you can see. However, coal is the major share of our energy mix, followed by oil. We import about 85% of our oil. When it comes to electricity generation, coal will remain the major share with 54% generation capacity, accounting for about 72% of our generation share. We have been installing a few coal plants, but at the same time, we are phasing out old inefficient coal plants in the last 5 years. We have actually declared a target of 500 gigawatts of renewable by 2030, which it should be noted that it's 5 times the current capacity that we have. Over the past decade, 750 million people have gained access to electricity, but we have a policy of electricity for all. So to provide 24/7 electricity access, much more needs to be done. I would also like to point out that agriculture is one of the hard to abate sectors for India. Almost 60% of the employment is in this sector. And this is one of the most vulnerable sector and is responsible for the major non-CO2 emissions, especially methane and NOx. LULUCF removes almost 15% of our carbon emissions, and all this mitigation actions are going on. Next, please. In 2015, India.
Okay,
Next.
sorry.
Yeah. So in 2015, we submitted our NDCs, and the goals highlighted in red are mitigation actions. Next slide, please. Development is a priority for India, And we have been, since Paris Agreement, every year increasing our ambition targets. And this is one slide that shows that. So if you see, pre-Paris, we had a goal of 100 gigawatts of renewables, which in post-Paris in 2015 was increased to 175 gigawatts. In 2019, this was increased to 450 gigawatts. And last year, the Prime Minister declared that we will achieve 500 gigawatt of renewable target. So that we have been, it is not just power sector, when it comes to industry, transport, building, agriculture, waste, as well as water sector, we have been improving on our ambitions every year. So apart from NDCs, internally, India has been improving its targets especially post-Paris. Next slide, please. So this slide kind of shows the COP26 declarations. Initially, we just had 3 mitigation goals. Now we have more than 7. So as you can see, number 3, the emission intensity to GDP increased from 33% to 45% by 2030. We have a 500 gigawatt renewable target, additional sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. We have increased our non-fossil fuel capacity share from 40% to 50% by 2030. We will mitigate about 1 billion ton of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2030. And India is one of the countries where the railway sector of India has pledged towards net zero by 2030. And this all would be helpful, of course, for India to become net zero by 2070. In addition to these goals, India has shown leadership in launching the International Solar Alliance, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, and most recently, the One Sun, One World, One Grid with UK at COP26 last year. Next slide, please. So it's not only the government. What we see is the Indian corporates announcing net zero in the past 2 or 3 years. Reliance, Adani, Tata, these are companies which have their footprint in energy infrastructure as well as the infrastructure. We have more than 20 Indian corporates announcing internal carbon pricing from $10 to $120 per ton of carbon equivalent. And I need to mention specially, this is not done because of government push. The corporates themselves have announced it on their own. Next slide, please. We did a calculation about the emissions, and in this, we found that by 2030, we will be achieving the NDC target that we have declared in the last COP26 declaration. Next slide, please. Keeping this in mind, we tried to explore the current policy scenarios which extrapolated the ongoing and planned policies and deep decarbonization scenario, where DDS1 emphasized on the development priorities of our country and DDS2 focused more on the mitigation actions towards net zero. Next slide, please. What we saw and observed and estimated was that compared to CPS scenario, the DDS1 scenario was able to reduce 28 billion tons of carbon. With LULUCF, it was 32 billion tons. And the for DDS2, this increased to 44 billion tons. And with LULUCF, it was 50 billion tons. And these results are within the range of the global models that have been submitted. Next, just one more click. I would like to inform that India's historical cumulative emissions sum is less than 5% from 1850 to 2019. But in the future budget for CPS scenario, we will be accounting for 6 to 15%, and for DDS scenario, it would be around 4 to 11%. Next slide, please. So this slide kind of shows the sectoral emissions, where one can see it's the power sector that is basically reducing the most in under DDS scenario. So it's a lot on power sector, how our emissions would be reduced and how the energy sector is transformed. This is supported by mitigation actions in the transport sector through fuel shift, modal shift, moving towards electric vehicles, which is complemented by the forestry sector, which is a huge carbon sink. However, what we found was industry would remain one of the hard to abate sectors for India, where we will need CCUS. And green hydrogen would take time. It depends on how green hydrogen is developed at international level, that it would be implemented and installed in India. Next slide, please. Just we need to note that India's development needs will influence the commitment to our peaking and net zero, where on the left side you could see that most of our goals are development goals. And we also need to, at the same time, focus on the energy infrastructure that is required to achieve these development goals. Next slide, please. And we also are looking at the sustainable goals that can be achieved. So we have the SDG 7, SDG 15, SDG 3 that can be simultaneously achieved. However, the degree of this achievement depends on how rigorous is the implementation. Next slide, please. So with all this, there are challenges. When we talk about coal, the DDS scenarios talks about phasing out coal. And we have, with the demand rising, especially in steel sector and industry sector, we will be still importing about 200 million tons. So how do we import? From where do we import? Should we import? Are there other alternatives? As we phase out coal, there will be stranded assets in the form of mines, transport. 45% of Indian Railways freight revenue comes from coal transport. Similarly, in power, the actions in the current decade will determine the cost of transitions in the long-term lock-ins. As we install renewables, we need to look into grid integration technology, the flexibility that is required, battery costs, the battery supply chain, and the critical minerals that would be required for the battery supply chain. Again, in power, we looked at stranded assets that would be huge if we need to phase out early by 2050. Next, please. Industry will be one of the hard to abate sectors. Most of the mitigation actions are being taking place in the large point sources. So small and medium scale enterprises need to be involved in overall reduction of emissions. We need CCUS, and we also need to look into how the production, storage, and transport of hydrogen is taking place. Similarly, in transport, infrastructure, the charging infrastructure, as well as the battery costs would be huge. At the same time, what is the penetration of biofuels? And when it comes to electric mobility, passenger transport is taking place. It would be road freight that would have much more difficulty to transform to electric vehicles. Next slide, please. Forestry, again, the NDC 5 carbon additional sink is quite aspirational. Agriculture is a hard to abate sector, not only from mitigation perspective, but from impacts, resilient building, and climate change adaptation perspective. We also need to additionally look at the vulnerability of these energy infrastructure, low-income rural population, and impact of global and local financial shocks and pandemics and wars. Next slide, please. So just a quick look at the power sector investment alone. So India puts in about $100 billion each year for climate adaptation, and this is likely to reach $300 billion. And one can see if we are doing a current policy scenario, if we are implementing it, we need $120 billion annually. For a 2C or a well below 2C scenario, the range is almost double, so 160 to 270. So we need investment to move towards coal phase out and energy transitions. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, India will not be net zero by 2050 under any scenario that we have worked on. For the world to be net zero by 2050, the developed countries therefore need to have ambitious plans to be net negative. We need to involve multinational, transnational businesses and industries in climate change discussions and actions. Some of the top Indian businesses have committed to become net zero and internalize carbon price in India, but this action needs to be consolidated at an international level. We need international investments for sustainable transitions. We do not have a carbon market, so we need international support to create a vibrant carbon market and link it with other carbon markets around the world. This will enhance the economic efficiency of GHG mitigations all over the world. Next slide, please. Coal is a global concern with almost 12 countries as presented: China, US, Indonesia, Australia, Germany, Russia, South Africa, South Korea, Poland, Turkey. We account for 88% of global coal consumption. So therefore, we need a global solution for coal phase out, which needs to be including technology and finance. We think that it would require at least one generation to phase out an entrenched energy system in a developing country like India. International embargo, therefore, on coal financing will only create financial headwinds. We require policy instruments like ADB that is helping countries to move out of coal transitions to amplify. Developed countries and India are collaborating for incentivizing solar, wind, BECCS, hydrogen fuel in the next 2-3 decades. We have bilateral cooperation agreements with 83 countries, and we are supporting developing countries in Southeast Asia and Africa for solar and bio. But apart from this, we also need to look into all GHG gases for net zero, and adaptation needs to come back to the table when we are focusing on a developing country like India. Next slide, please. I wanted to show this slide to show that we are having ongoing conversations, which is dynamic. The policy is quite dynamic in India. So we need to have these discussions, not only with policymakers, but people who are in the sectors implementing these policies and actions. We are also engaging with professors, we are engaging with scientists, we are engaging with engineers. We are also having outreach for the youth, for the next generation to be aware and to take forth the transition that is required for India. Next slide, please. And just a brief of the current work we are doing, which shows that we will exceed our NDC targets, but yet we will not reach net zero by 2050. The future of coal in each scenario hinges on how our power and industry sector will develop in the coming decades. And for coal-dependent countries like India, energy security is essential. So we also have the economic, socio-political compulsions. Unless this is taken care of, coal will continue as a main source of energy for India. And the last, the sectoral decarbonization is significantly dependent. Next slide, please. Is significantly dependent on decarbonized electricity. There are a lot of uncertainties on the type of fuels that will replace coal. The future of development of renewables is based on the grid integration technologies and the battery costs and the availability of raw materials. and the social acceptability and geological uncertainty of other alternatives and CCUS. So just a small like backhand fact is, if we phase out coal, 227 billion tons will be stranded, which is equivalent to about 6.5 trillion US dollars. And this is the amount we need as a country to transform to a net zero, low carbon economy. And renewable energy offers significant opportunities. However, jobs, it's a different skill set. And as you can see, the eastern side of India is where the coal mines are, and all the new jobs are in the south and the western side. So just transitions would play a huge role in the coming conversations that we have. Last slide, please. I would like to acknowledge all my colleagues and co-workers, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Right. Thank you very much, Saritha, for joining us and for this incredible deep dive into India, including the progress that has been made, but also still some of the challenges that the country is facing. Are there any questions for clarification? And Saritha will be there for the final Q&A as well. Just, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Gideon Behar from Israel. I have two questions. One, if you can elaborate more on carbon trading system or market that you have mentioned. And the second one is, you have mentioned a few times that India will rely for the coming years still a lot on coal, but the prices of renewables are going dramatically down. So how do you arrange it in terms of markets and prices, etc.? Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for the question. For the first question on the carbon markets, India does not have a carbon market. We do have an energy savings market, but we do not have the carbon market. So we need to establish carbon market for GHG mitigation. And for this, we will require international support. As for the second question, we have about, I think, latest figures, I don't remember, but about 200 gigawatts of coal capacity in India. Even though we are introducing 500 gigawatts of solar, keeping in mind the technical efficiency, it does not replace coal in any way. We require storage, which is very expensive. Critical minerals are located at specific geolocations. So we are looking into base loads that can be replaceable, and nuclear is coming out because we need to be self-sufficient as a country as well. We cannot go from importing oil to importing energy technology to importing critical minerals. We need to be a self-sufficient country. Coal is the basis because we have coal as a reserve. And it's an international pressure that we need to phase out coal. If left to ourselves and we do not have any other means, we will continue coal. So it is in international benefit that they need to help us with finances and technology to transfer away from coal, because currently it's quite expensive for us. And when it comes to renewables, at a national level, we have the target, but sub-national level, there are challenges emerging when we talk about grid integration, when we talk about battery cost that is required. So there are 6 phases and how the renewables are integrated into the grid. So in the first and second phase, it's much more easier that the grid can take, but it's the revenue for the discoms that becomes a problem in many of the subnational in states. So there needs to be policies for these transitions to take place and the discoms to be able to basically weather this transitions. So yeah, there are many problems. Even if we have one of the lowest costs when it comes to renewables, when it comes to implementation of those renewables, as well as replacing coal, it becomes kind of difficult because it's a huge amount that needs to be replaced.
Right, thank you, Saritha. There's one more question at the back. Two. Please try and keep them brief, and again, please introduce yourself briefly.
Yes, thank you. David Kay from United States. Can you say a little bit about whether India's plans for decarbonizing the grid and for electrifying are likely to be based primarily on large centralized facilities, including renewables, or whether it's likely to be more what we would some of us would call distributed, smaller scale generation facilities, and what the pros and cons are and why?
So when, first of all, thank you for the question. It's a very good question. It is a bit of both. So when we actually had the policy a decade ago, 100 gigawatts of renewables, 100 gigawatts when it changed, 60 was the grid utility and 40 was rooftop. So rooftop is the more distributed kind. It's the grid utility that has taken, that the penetration has been faster, the rooftop not so much. So, and there are states which basically promote. So the western states, as you could see in the diagram, the southern states have promoted solar and wind, and hence the both grid as well as rooftop can be seen. Though rooftop is a little bit difficult because there is a question in many of the states, there is no policy if the extra electricity that is produced can be given back to the grid. So what is the revenue model that is required? So that is an emerging challenge in many of the states where the policies are not there. What would be the revenue model for the discoms as well as the prosumers? So those are some upcoming challenges, but at the same time, grid integration and other technologies are required for additional renewables to be part of the central grid. And just to answer the question, both are taking place, but it's the grid utility that has gained more traction in the past few years rather than the segregated form of solar. I hope I've answered your question.
Okay, thanks, Saritha. Final question, and then we'll move on to the final speaker.
My name is Emily Faint. I'm from Our 2050 World and the British Standards Institute. I suppose I have a sort of a simple question. You've mentioned different levels of actors here and where policies are and are not. In your opinion, is it the situation that every level of actor in India knows what they need to do and the challenge is just finding the support and funding to do so? Or do you think there are still different levels of governance in India that are unclear on what their role is in the net zero transition?
Thank you, Emily, for this question. And here I would take this opportunity to say that we are now engaging at a countrywide level, sectoral level stakeholder engagement when it comes to coal transition. And what we have observed is people at leadership level, whether it is the coal sector, the coal mining sector, the power sector, the transport sector, the national policies, and certain state policies where coal is the main revenue. They are aware of the challenges that they face. However, it's the entire value chain. What is the middle plant level? The miners, are they aware? Not so much. They are aware of the short-term kind of priorities for themselves, but not the long term about coal phase out. And when we are talking about implementation, we require not only the planning, but the entire value chain to be aware and what goes into that process. So at different governance level, depending on what works for their government. So for the western states and the southern states who are more into renewable are very much aware about the policies of renewables, and they are trying to make policies or regulations which could help grid integration and everything. But when it comes to the coal regions, they are still debating on how to transition away from coal because it's central to their region. So it is at various degrees when it comes to policies. When it comes to leaders in each of these sectors, they are aware. They have certain places. What everyone is looking at is the window of opportunity and then the feasibility of that action and then the sustainability of the action, which would bring revenue for them. So that is where the whole complex system kind of works. So, and it is going to be really interesting how India develops. It would be at various degrees, though we have a national policy, how each of the state would be incorporating those policies in their own state action plans in this coming decade.
All right, thanks again, Saritha. And you already highlighted both in your presentation and in the discussion the importance of international cooperation. So that's a nice bridge with the final speaker, last but certainly not least, Sebastian Oberthür, who will be talking about our work on advancing global climate governance for sectoral decarbonisation. The floor is all yours.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And thanks for bearing with us in this late hour in the side event, another presentation. I should first acknowledge the contribution of my colleague Simon Otto, who's not here, but you see on the slide, I guess. Next slide. I want to basically go through 3 points. First, present our approach to assessing sectoral governance gaps and policy options at the global level. And then secondly, go a little bit into the global governance for the decarbonization of energy-intensive industries, what our research so far has been. And then present some thoughts on a climate club for the decarbonization of the steel industry that was recently published actually in Nature Climate Change. Next slide, please. So this is part of the project, obviously. That's the more global international governance work. And what we're trying to do is to assess governance gaps and potentials to improve global governance for sectoral decarbonization. So how could we advance this sectoral decarbonization through action at the global level? This is updates and analysis that we had done in the previous Horizon project, namely the COP21 Ripples project, for those of you who may still remember that one. And in that project, we already covered transport and energy-intensive industries. So what's new here is then AFOLU and buildings of the 4 sectors that Wolfgang already mentioned to look at the role of global governance. The steps in the analysis are that we try to identify to what extent international governance can help overcome barriers and exploit opportunities that are there, to see what's missing and what could still be added, then map the existing contribution of international institutions against the number of governance functions that I'll present in a moment, and then importantly, and that we have added in addition to what COP21 Ripples did, to identify and assess options to close the existing governance gaps and exploit the potential. So to really go into what could we build, what could we extend at the global level to advance sectoral decarbonization. Next slide, please. So I was already mentioning the governance functions. Those serve as a guide kind of in the analysis. These are functions that we think international governance institutions can usefully perform. They can provide guidance and signal certain developments, direction of travel, sometimes called, right? They can set rules to facilitate collective action. They can enhance transparency and accountability, including through compliance mechanisms. They can provide means of implementation, capacity building, technology finance. They can diffuse knowledge and promote learning. And importantly, in a space where there are more and more international institutions and initiatives, they can also orchestrate and coordinate the existing institutions. And it is along those lines that we think about what is the contribution already and what could the contribution in the future be for sectoral decarbonization. Next slide, please. So what we then do here, as I said, we focus especially on options. we distinguish generally between reform of existing institutions, is essentially incremental change, or the creation of new institutions. And in that sense, if you fundamentally change an existing institution, that would count as a new institution also. And we're trying to go through the motions and assess what is the membership of institutions that exist, and would those cover those actors that one needs to advance sectoral decarbonization? What's the institutional capacity that they have and their statutes, etc.? What can they do? If they can't set rules, then they can't fulfill the governance function of setting rules, right? Some of them can do that, some of them can't do that. But then also look at the legitimacy, the authority that they have, including questions of equity. Are they accepted institutions across a broad range of actors, or are they contested? And then more broadly, look at the political feasibility, because obviously, especially when we think about near-term action that we need at the global level to advance sectoral decarbonization, if possible, in this decade still, then it needs to be feasible politically. That is obviously a difficult assessment to make. But that's our general line of thinking. We are in the middle of this kind of for these four sectors. So what I'm now going to present is where we are on the energy-intensive industries, which is the next slide. So we're first trying to map what's out there. Intergovernmental, that's the top layer, public-private collaboration, transnational, so more the private sector, distinguishing between more lasting institutions and perhaps less lasting or softer initiatives and policies. And we have tried to map what's out there. And if you go to the next slide, then one of the, I hope that's visible. Yes, so you see the ones with, I guess it was green and shows here as yellow, green. These are the ones that we have identified that have come in addition since we last did that analysis in 2018. And what's striking is kind of that there is a lot of activity in the sector, or in these sectors, perhaps, which one should say energy-intensive industries. A lot of new initiatives, of new policy initiatives that have emerged. Some of them are obviously still in the making, as you see at the top level. Some of the prominent ones are obviously the EU-US sectoral agreements. That doesn't exist yet, but is planned. The EU carbon border adjustment mechanism that is proposed, not enforced yet. And the forthcoming climate club proposal under the G7, which we'll probably learn more about at the end of this month. So that was kind of already one important finding in the research, to see the dynamism that exists, and that gives entry points for thinking about how to build the system further. If we go to the next slide, then we have tried, as I said, current supply, which functions are being fulfilled. That's the left side. I'm not going to read everything. And to the right side, try to identify remaining gaps. And I have highlighted here on the slide, as you can see, two gaps in particular in bold. And that is rules that would serve to, or also harmonize standards to create a market for decarbonized products. And then also address carbon leakage. This is, in the current system, not really addressed, at least not satisfactorily. And then I have also highlighted means of implementation, namely technology diffusion to developing countries that needs to be advanced, but also more general investment in technology development in some of the subsectors. And I'll come back to that, but if we go to the next slide, then we obviously need to be aware that there are certain differences between the subsectors. We especially look at steel, cement, chemicals, and aluminium. In steel, that's a lot of the focus. If you look at the mapping before that I showed, a lot of these institutions address steel. There's a lot going on already in terms of procurement of clean steel and the rollout of breakthrough technologies. I'll come back to that. A little bit a similar picture with respect to aluminium, except that there's not a lot of institutions, but it's often addressed together with steel in the carbon border adjustment mechanism of the EU, etc. That's both included. Cement is a little bit different. It's more a regional market. Steel and aluminium is a more global international market. There are some procurement targets for cement. And chemicals is perhaps the one where the technology development is least clear among those. And actually by now addressed only by a few of the international institutions that exist. Next slide, please. So what we are then looking at is, and that is really at the moment the ongoing work, reforming institutions. What could one imagine? So several of the things that are already ongoing could obviously be enhanced. Do we need a more central decarbonization vision for energy-intensive industries? Could that be done at the UNFCCC Paris Agreement level? Sectoral decarbonization commitments, where additional procurement commitments to create markets, right? So we're trying to think that through, but we're also getting to the point where, that's the second section on the slide, we think that there is a case to be made for creating new institutions, initiatives, for potentially having a new climate club or new climate clubs, for creating expanding markets and addressing competitiveness and trade concerns in an equitable manner, obviously. That's important. And also to have additional means to diffuse and accelerate the diffusion of these technologies to developing countries. So, as I said, that's ongoing thinking. And if we go to the next slide, then one of the things that has already come out, as I said, you find a reference on the top of the slide, is what was just published in Nature Climate Change, namely a climate club to decarbonize the global steel industry. A few thoughts about that. So the key challenges identified there is technological, economic, political uncertainty at the bottom of the list. But then the rollout of decarbonized technologies that do exist in principle but need to come to market. The spread to developing countries, which are already mentioned. High capital costs and implied financial risks, and competitiveness and carbon leakage concerns. So it's a bit specific to steel, but also more generally applicable, I guess, to energy-intensive industries. If we go to the next slide, just to illustrate also the point that we do need diffusion of these technologies. It shows that the big parts are the future steel demand, which is primarily, as you can see, in China, India, Africa, etc. And then it tracks against that on a completely different scale, the number of projects that are in the pipeline for producing decarbonized steel. And there you see that most of them are in Europe, and only few of them are in the markets where they need to be in the future. So that's just to illustrate that it needs to diffuse. Next slide, please. So what are then some key tasks and features that a climate club for the decarbonization of the steel industry could and should address? Market creation, which first of all also requires that we have a common definition of what is decarbonized steel and how do we recognize it when we see it, because steel usually looks like steel, right? So we may need labeling, certification, more procurement to create a market, and subsidies in the form of carbon contracts for difference. Yeah, that's one area. Addressing carbon leakage, as I said, and competitiveness, also trade measures, market access, carbon pricing. Perhaps a 2025 moratorium on new unabated capacity, which is what science would tell us would be required. Then also flanking measures, when you think about it, where does the electricity and the hydrogen come from that we need then for decarbonized steel? And importantly, thinking about support for developing countries that are needed for investments, technology sharing, procurement, flanking measures. So we need to broaden that development beyond Europe and developed countries. In terms of participation, we then thought should probably be government-led, but with strong stakeholder participation. Buyers, producers, civil society, existing initiatives need to be in. what perhaps we still need to think a little bit further about it, how would this relate to other existing initiatives and institutions? Would it have a kind of orchestrating function as well of the many things that are ongoing? And how could we address the demand side that also science tells us is not only about decarbonizing supply of steel, but also reducing demand of steel? Would there be, should we at some point negotiate about limits on steel production? But okay, that's perhaps for the future and for us to think about. But perhaps one of the important messages coming out of this last slide is when people talk about carbon clubs, they frequently think about carbon pricing. And that's it. Like, let's coordinate carbon pricing. And one of the main messages of the publication and also of our work is this is far, far beyond carbon pricing. There is more to be thought about. And that is why a carbon club, for example, should have a strong dimension of how we get these technologies to developing countries and developing country participation, therefore, also. And one needs to think about that. So it's much more than carbon pricing. Thanks very much for your attention.
Right, thank you, Sebastian. All right, then we have about, I would say 15 minutes for final round of Q&A. I still have one remaining question from the previous round, but I also see another hand in the back. Let's start maybe with the question that we still had in reserve, which is a question probably for Saritha. And I think it's you, Jan from German Watch.
Thank you for all these very good talks. One question to India is about implementation of all these measures. How do you see the chance that, especially in the, as far as I know, the situation within the states in India is very different regarding implementation of all these measures. How high do you see the chance for implementation, especially regarding the international finance, the support question of developed countries to India?
Yeah, so here we are tracking actually at a state level how the implementation, especially of renewable targets, are taking place. So like any other countries, we have certain front runners, there are certain laggards, there are certain followers, and there are certain who have started well but then stopped. So they are at different degrees. And it is a combination of the state policy implementation and what is actually going on at a ground level. That is number one. But when it comes to international cooperation, we are also simultaneously, the Ministry of Finance is looking into the taxonomies and seeing how firms can become more green through their disclosure, and having the, like the EU taxonomy, have India's rating of industries and sectors become better. So we have at a, not only at a national level, but at a sectoral level, cooperation, international cooperation and investment for these sectors to become greener. And when it comes to investment, you have one investment on low carbon products, that is solar, wind. Then you have investment in transitional industries like the semiconductor industry. And then you have the transformational industries like the iron and steel and the cement industry. What we are right now observing is most of the investment is going into low carbon products because the returns are higher, the returns are faster. What we need to look in long term is we need to also support these industries, and this is by making these firms and industries at international level so people can invest in India, and it is most cost effective to invest in India, and that is something we need to discuss at a global level. When we are talking about economic efficiencies, it is much more cost effective to invest in a developing country. Of course, there are policy implementation laggards that the country needs to work on, and India as a developing country is working on those aspects. So it is like it's a multiple transitions occurring spatially, temporally, we are aware, the government is aware, and we are trying to see how we can best use the opportunities that are given to us and hopefully try to scale it up and speed it up as much as possible in this decade.
Right, thank you, Saritha. I have at least two more hands, one in the back, one on the left, and then sir in the front.
Thank you. It's me again. Emily Fain from the British Standards Institution and speaking with a My 2050 World hat on. This time my question is for Sebastian, if I may. I really enjoyed your presentation, and in particular my eye was caught on the slide about challenges and there being a gap in harmonisation of standards. My question is there a bit more of a deep dive you can give or any more detail you can give on that point, and where in particular you see the gap of standards having a big impact? I asked that question so that we can identify on that sectoral level where we can do more.
Right, thank you. Excellent question. Let's take a few more questions so that everyone at least has a chance to share their question or comment. So we have one over there. It's a bit of a trick to get the mic over there.
Thank you. Yvonne Deng from 7Gen. It's a question for Saritha again, actually about India. You already spoke, I think you made a very strong case for the need for finance. I wanted to ask specifically whether you can speak to technology gaps. Are there very specific technologies that you see that are lacking in India that we could help with technology transfer? And you mentioned grid integration, and you just now mentioned the different types of investment categories. Are there any specific technologies that you would still highlight?
Right.
Thanks.
Thank you. And then one more question, and then we'll go first to you, Sebastian, and then to Saritha again.
Thank you, Gideon Bechar from Israel. Question for Sebastian. You put the emphasis rightly on decarbonization of the steel sector, but I think that there is a possibility to go even one step further, and this is to become carbon negative in the sector of concrete or cement by the creation of synthetic limestone or synthetic aggregate, or by the sequestration of CO2 from the atmosphere in order to create the huge amounts that we need for preparing aggregate and cement. I would like to hear your opinion about that. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for these questions. Right, Sebastian, I think there's two questions aimed at you.
Yeah.
If you can answer them both, or at least try to.
Yeah, I'll try to. When I said standards, I should perhaps clarify just in case I was not specifically thinking about technical standards, if that was perhaps the understanding, but more like standards in the sense of rules or things. And I already talked about that. For example, we don't have an internationally shared understanding of what decarbonized steel would be, what decarbonized cement would be, or negative cement. But let's start modestly and then expand. If you do labeling, what I also mentioned, certification, you will need to have certain standards, right, for that. What is it that's getting the label and what does not get the label? So that is what I thought in terms of standards. And obviously we have that already in the discussion about the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, right? That's certainly okay. Who's determining what's taxed with what amount, etc. at the border. And I think there's a certain case to be made for this if you want to do that across the globe, essentially, to somehow have a discussion about that in a forum. That's why it's put forward here as a task also for a potential climate club, where one has a broader debate than just one actor. But please do come back on that if you wish. Carbon negative cement, we now analyze steel. We'll have to look at cement. But as far as I understand, the main challenge at the moment in cement technologically is to actually get to zero rather than negative. And so far, it seems the lead technology is carbon capture and storage to try to do that. Perhaps if one combines that, then one can get negative. Sure, but that's then the target that one can have. Perhaps we then need kind of for that area 2 labels, or I don't know, a green one and a double green one, or I don't know where it can become carbon negative. We'll certainly have to explore all these options anyway to get as low as possible, including negative, if that's possible, right? But I'm not enough of an engineer to know all the ins and outs of how we could get there. But we'll look at it.
Sorry for interrupting, but I can just tell you that...
Sorry, could you at least, if you speak in the microphone, because otherwise the people online cannot hear you.
Thank you. There is a difference between cement and concrete.
Yeah.
Because concrete you make also mostly from aggregates. And aggregates today you can make also by capturing CO2 from the atmosphere, atmospheric CO2.
Yeah.
And you will create synthetic limestone.
Yeah.
And the material we use the most by human after water is aggregates. It's billions of tons every year, so the potential to sequester huge amounts of CO2 exists already there, and there are some technologies that are developing or starting in that direction.
Yeah. Fair point, but yeah, we'll take that gladly into account. But the general thinking about the international cooperation probably would remain the same, but point taken, thanks.
All right, thanks. Saritha, then you had a question about the technology needs for India.
Yeah, so first of all, I would also try to actually suggest to please check our BUR3, where there's a whole section on the technology needs for India at every sector. But the main, when we talk about India, is renewables. So installation of this highest ambition that we have of 500 gigawatts, it's the battery. That would be a huge constraint, because we are not only looking at battery for power sector, we are also looking at battery for the electrification of our transport sector. So there are different kinds of batteries that are required for the production of battery, where the manufacturing will be done. Will it be done in India? The critical minerals that are required, what will be the sustainability of that value chain? India already has a failed manufacturing policy. So when we had the National Solar Mission in 2008-2010, we had a policy of manufacturing solar cells in India in order to be self-sufficient. However, China came in and the manufacturing costs completely decreased like anything in the last decade. So India could not actually have manufacturing, basically it was not even started, like the policy was not able to be implemented successfully. So now again, we are trying with solar and battery. Let's see how the costs, international costs. So here it's the international costs which will play a huge role in how the manufacturing sector for all these supply chains that we require, the battery, the solar, even in the industry sector, the hydrogen, it would be how hydrogen technology is developed at an international level, and the cost of hydrogen that comes down. Because if today we ask the steel industry, India is one of the most cost efficient steel industry in the world. So for them, it is quite expensive to have hydrogen as an alternative. So they are looking at hydrogen costs. They are trying to produce hydrogen. And if it is cheap enough for them, only then will they implement. So the Indian companies which are abroad are having green steel in Europe, but it is not as cost effective to have green steel right now in this decade in India. So those are certain things where it's not only the government, but the businesses are trying how to make it cost effective. And here, these are at least starting some of the places where we require investment, but we require cooperation, because even in batteries, something that has not been observed is, are the batteries climate compatible? India, there are states which right now have a temperature higher than 45 degrees C. So there are certain batteries that could be developed and maybe possible to use it in colder regions. It is not feasible in India. So we need to look at what are the materials that would be feasible in India. So those are certain things which we not only require the finance, but R&D, cooperation. So it is a combination of everything that is required in a developing country, and the same applies. And we have examples where we have then transferred this technology to places like Africa, because from a development climate perspective, it is almost the same. So those are certain things we are doing from our end, and we require finance for all these. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Saritha. And we've come towards the end of our time. If you were very inspired by the presentations, feel free to check out the NDC Aspects website, which is ndc-aspects.eu, or check us out on Twitter at NDC Aspects. But most importantly, thank you all for coming. It was very nice to see so many people in one of the more distant rooms in the building. But thanks above all to our speakers, both here in Bonn, as well as in Barcelona, or somewhere in Spain, and in Tsukuba in Japan. So thanks so much all, and hope to see you again in the conference halls in the coming days. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. I can leave? Is it okay?
I think, Saritha,
okay.
I think you can...
See ya. See ya.
See you, thanks.
Bye.
Saritha.
Have a good day. Good evening.
Have a good night.
Yeah.
Sleep well.